Well, thank you. Yes, but Clint mentioned that I come from an IT background, and I do, right? So when Mark talked about mainframes and mini computers, that was me. And very much like in the telecommunication industry, things evolve very quickly, and a lot of the taxonomies and data interchange and those types of things were fundamental to make cell phones and everything else work. I remember it was probably, was it 1993? Yeah, 1993, 1994, I remember celebrating the 100,000th cell phone customer, right? So now, fast forward to 2001, we were celebrating just about 2 million cell phone customers, right? So we had exponential growth year over year, and if we didn't get through a lot of these practices, it wasn't going to happen and evolve to where we have cell phones universally across the globe. So my goals are to understand what Project Haystack is, and the importance of information management from BIM to analytics and current state. So I'm going to bring probably a practical example of making BIM useful in a different context, right? So kind of tying usage and how to evolve BIM past construction and make the compelling reason to develop and build a BIM practice. What is Project Haystack? Project Haystack predominantly comes from the building controls world. It is one of the big founders. There's a company called Sky Foundry. Some may or may not know a gentleman by the name of John Petsey. John Petsey was and Brian Frank were the inventors of the Tritium and or Niagara platform, right? So they have moved beyond that. They are now trying to deal with exactly the same problem that we're having on the buildings control side, is not too dissimilar from what's happening on the BIM side. What we want to look for is when we're doing building controls are not just temperature controls in a room, but also things like lighting control, temperature, heating, settings, right, setbacks, right, energy management, metering are all tied together. How do we control and manage this data? So we've decided to standardize on the Haystack approach because of dealing with different naming complexities and challenges that we see in the industry. Who's involved? As you can see from the list, a huge number of companies. Probably one of the biggest things where Haystack is really shining is how do we deal with this thing called IoT, or the the Internet of Everything, right? Internet of Things. We have enough challenge trying to deal with controls and lighting in a given room, but we have a thing called IoT on the forefront, where particularly if you're a building operator, right, and you have multiple tenants, they're going to bring their own devices. They're going to have their own lighting control, right? They're going to want to plug in their meters. How do we manage that, right? So companies like Intel and Siemens are on the forefront trying to figure out how to adapt and manage and control this information. So there's a large support trying to address this very key part of making this stuff work in the future. So from the neat thing that I find with Stuart Olson and why an IT guy went from managing SAP and complex billing and charging systems to buildings is because of the footprint and where we are with buildings as a state, as a whole, right? So I lived in Toronto for a number of years, currently live in Vancouver. We've done a lot, and buildings are part of our culture, right? And whether it's roads and pathways, spaces, buildings, these are very key things that what's going to look like in 50, 75, 100 years, right? So bridges are falling apart, sure. Buildings is one part where I think, from my perspective, have the most passion. And from a Stuart Olson perspective, shares that as well. So kind of really what it gets down to is how can we help, right? And part of what we talked about collaboration is the Haystack. If you go to projecthaystack.org, it's very open, right? It don't require a lot of usernames and passwords and everything else to set up. Go to projecthaystack.org, right? And there's a whole different areas that are trying to be developed, right, that would relate to BIM, and BIM Haystack integration is one of those working groups. So kind of on the technical side, what we're doing here is, if you look at a taxonomy of a BIM object, right, what would show is how it's related to a haystack object, right? So instead of having a very complex, although it needs to be very complex, how do you make it easier to understand so that whether you have a BIM system that's developed by one group and another group developed another BIM system, how do we make them talk so that we have commonality, right? So you actually have the ability to move between the different models that may be presented to you, right? So even though we have the same objects on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, the haystack methodology allows us to provide a more natural language, and also has context and description, right? So you're not guessing at what AHU-146419 might be, right? You know, it's an air handler. Here are the temp sensors for those objects. So, and that's where probably is probably one of the hook points. So when you have somebody at the other end receiving BIM that needs it for their operation, right, fortifies what BIM is required and needed to do. So what we've done is defined this kind of a rough draft of the areas that we'd be looking at dealing with, right? So we have HVAC, right, and the IFC domain, IFC HVAC domain. I decided to at least start the conversation with the domain-specific classes of the IFC, right? Because we already have, from a haystack perspective, nomenclature for VFDs, AHU boilers, tanks, VAVs, unitary type equipment, right? So we do have a path forward out of the box, right? So if we look at an IFC, right, the working group are going to build documentation and a methodology, ontology of how to map between those different IFC models. Like if you're going to use Excel, or you're going to use ArcView, or you're going to use Navisworks, right? It's open to what tools you want to use, but here's how we need to move between the two systems. Electrical, again, IFC electrical domain, right? Electrical panels, lighting, networks. So that would also include things like the low voltage wiring loops for controls for mechanical, to network and outlet ports and Wi-Fi access points. And this projector, for example, could be described and be brought into that model. Probably near and dear to me is energy and metering, right? IFC flow meter. That's probably going to spend, for me personally, for the next couple of years, going to spend the most time dealing with how to manage from a metering strategy plan, right? That's probably one thing from BIM that I would want to see happen, is have a metering strategy when you do BIM. Rather than having it as a post activity left after construction, metering strategy and putting it in there would be a huge windfall. The next thing is actually, it was kind of hit me. There was one of the other members of the group was talking about this from the security working group. They want to involve and build the security domain for controlling and managing security aspects and assets. Location and GIS. Building controls is very, I would not even say 3D, maybe 2D at best, is location, right? So we have the different datums that are stored within BIM and used from AutoCAD, BIM, Revit. How do we position and manage and locate where that wireless access point or where that VAV is located in 3D space. So how do we map that from a controls perspective? Because from a building operator perspective, they may not know the datums that are required to identify those in space in real time. The other one too is if we get into energy modeling and BIM and FM, I took kind of the concept, like I said at the top, IFC 4 add 2, right, was more to deal with BIM FM, right, and where the BIM community is evolving towards a BIM FM type of world. Building geometry is a huge topic that will happen as we build models and use BIM data, right? So having a closed wall or open wall and how those polygons are being completed will have ramifications in the future on how we would map that. That's why I put it as a to-do, is even from a building controls perspective, volumes and building volumetric and geometries are not necessarily part of that thought process today, but can see that evolving, right? And we need that community there to evolve what that practice would look like. So I said, kind of from a current state perspective, and depends on the implementation as well, right? Because there isn't necessarily a standard approach for implementing a BIM model. So we have an ontology for managing that, right? And the entity inherence of the BIM model will be key, right? So the templates that we define and build, and how we feed that into our systems, right, will be a fundamental keystone from my perspective on building effective BIM models. Any questions so far? Yeah, so I'm going to save some time here today, but opportunity, right, the practical approach for leveraging BIM data. This is just one example of many, right, but where we're actually taking this forward, I think more than just an experiment, but the ability to try this in practical, real-life terms, right? Leveraging, and probably the biggest thing too, BIM from that perspective, we're going to have to go outside of that, is leveraging time series data, right? IFCs do not lend themselves well to storing huge volumes of real-time data, right? So this would be one mechanism to help enable augmentation with other systems that can handle 3 years of energy consumption data, for example, but yet have it tied to BIM. Probably the other benefit too is human and machine readable, right? The Haystack protocol and technology allows you to develop something that a human can read, but also from a machine can read as well. And like I said as well, common approach design for implementation for key systems, right? Adopted, the Haystack, this is probably the biggest note as well. It's very important to understand. This is probably going to happen regardless. OBIX, right, Oasis 2.0 will be based upon Haystack. It's also adopted by ASHRAE for BACnet XD, right? So there's been a lot of conversation about Niagara 4.0, 4.x platform, and what they're doing with analytics and visualization is that the Haystack methodology will be BACnet XD extensions, right? So you'll have uniformity between BACnet and Haystack and BIM. So by nature, right, the ecosystem is now expanded. I would say as well, extended functionality for next generation BIM, right? So if you're fairly involved on the software development side for AutoCAD and Revit, the Autodesk Forge platform, right? You now have a new avenue, right, to explore as well. So kind of from a next steps perspective, this is just an introduction and where things are going. We're still at early days with the working group in Haystack and BIM, but would more than enjoy having a larger team, larger Canadian representation as well on the working group. And again, projecthaystack.org, download, right? There's lots of code bits, and you don't have to pay for the software. Laptop and Java, right? You can run and execute and do your own stuff as well, right? Not limited to commercial software. And questions? That's the brain building in Las Vegas, actually. All done in BIM. They had some curvy lines and whatnot there, so. Any questions, or good? Okay, thank you. Oh.
Got a question full of them today. Can you go back to that circle slide real quick?
Go.
I was going to ask you that too.
So what do you think's the biggest, if that's the perfect scenario, where do you think the biggest crack in that wheel is currently?
My opinion?
Yeah.
Documentation, construction, logistics to day two handoff. I would say and that we talked a bit about earlier why BIM can't be adopted. We talked a lot about the methodology and who owns the BIM model. And I would say too is I think from industry, we also have to look at liability, right? I think there's people feel victimized, whether you're the consultant, the architect. Well, they have my data and they'll have proof of something or whatever, right? It's easier to deal from a drawing perspective. Which is fine. I completely appreciate that, and I'm talking this very openly because I think this is probably one of the biggest barriers for us as a group and a governance perspective to bring that together to help manage those expectations between the different professions would be a huge barrier, and I think a big win in the North American and Canada. I think we could demonstrate that as well.
Right. So then simplifying that may also answer that question from earlier about changing the culture for on the other side of the fence.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Yeah, so that what we do is we have, I've seen it with many organizations, I deal with being a national company, I've seen it everywhere and it keeps coming back up. Well, it's my model. Well, here, I'll give you an extract. Okay, right, so get it. So when people may or may not build their own model, they may, like the same job may have 2 or 3 different BIM models, right, in some cases, extreme cases. But I think if we give a platform or a mechanism for interlock, and it gets back to information management governance, we can have, I think, a collaboration where there's safety involved, right, where it's a safe environment to make those changes, right, and for that model to live past handoff.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Good.
Good.
Thank you, Chris.
Yep, thank you.